Hello, this is Heath the Car Theist with X-Garage. I'm just posting up a quick video that's a response to a YouTube video that was brought to our attention that was a rebuttal against something that Jake the Snake had posted. And so this video is entitled, "Is Atheism Dead?" And it was put up by a group. The name is BITCH Spot blog. So we'll just call that BS blog moving forward. So I will try to keep this as brief as possible, but since I'm reading the texts from the video, from their rebuttal, it'll take a little bit of time there, but I'm going to try to wrap this up as quick as possible and keep it to the point. So Jake put out a video on TikTok, and it's basically saying the basic argument was a modus ponens argument of if the initial cause of the universe was unintentional, then the effects thereafter would be unintentional as well. That unintentional causes don't birth, of course, intentional effects. Anything that's accidental in nature might be a good category for understanding that. And so on the flip side, that would be a world without God, because of course if God creates a universe and he's intending it, he has by definition, by actually creating matter, there has been a willful response there, or a volitional act of a personal God, and so it's not incidental, right? So that's kind of the conversation, the context. So I just want to go straight in, and I'll share the link to their video, which you can watch. Probably the first 10 minutes will give you a good gist of their rebuttal and what they're thinking and their complaints. And it seems to me that they're coming from an atheistic position, since Jake's video was about atheism is dead. That's what he's doing. He's kind of doing a hyperbolic, rhetorical, having fun argument or play on words from Nietzsche's God is dead. And so anyhow, we'll just run through this. Now I've given a 5-minute introduction. Let's just go. So around the 4-minute 10 second mark to 18-second mark, at the 4-minute area, Jake the Snake lays out his basic argument, the form of the argument. He doesn't give the content yet. He just says, he gives what's a modus ponens argument, which is the rule of logic stating that if a conditional statement is accepted and the antecedent holds, then the consequent may be inferred. So this is just a standard if P then Q. If there's a dog in the box, then there's an animal in the box. There's a dog in the box, therefore there's an animal. That's what's going on here. So note Jake saying, he says Q may be inferred. He's just laying out the groundwork here. So he has not yet made an argument for certainty. That is, he has not made a claim for soundness. In logic, we would make a distinction between validity and soundness for deductive arguments, whereas inductive arguments, which is actually the basis of all scientific reasoning, the scientific method, which we'll get into here in a second, because the video claims that that's their method for all knowledge, which the scientific method, as inductive, cannot make any truth claims. It's only all based on probability. So inductive arguments are arguments that are based on probability, hypothetical reasoning, analogical reasoning, things like that. Analogical slightly, that's another conversation, but hypothetical reasoning is what it is. And so it's inductive. It cannot bring forth certainty, just high probability. So that's important to note. Anytime you're making a deductive argument coming from the scientific method, you're doing so based on just assumptions. You're assuming, okay, we've observed this so many times, we're just going to call it a truth. But really what it is, it's a concept, it's a model, it's a way of understanding life, but it's not certain. And so we'll get to that. So Jake just lays this out. He doesn't even argue for soundness. So the soundness of an argument often, if not always, like I was just mentioning, falls on grounds outside the inner logic and content of the argument itself. In other words, it grounds itself in presuppositions. If we're just talking from a scientific perspective, by granting a presupposition or a basic assumption, then the argument holds true and is valid. And this kind of comes into maybe the conflict that BS blog was kind of, maybe they were unaware of themselves, but they actually have assumptions coming into reading the data of life as well. As toward the end of the video, or middle of the video, excuse me, within the first 10 minutes, he notes that he doesn't need to appeal to order and design when looking at the world, as the world is functioning just well without it. But note how that's an assumption. He's assuming that the world is not designed. He's assuming that he's already has a starting point, a preconception that the data actually doesn't say technically. It just says he observes it, and it's probably, according to his interpretation of the data, it's probably not intended. It's probably not designed, and therefore it's working just fine without this intention or design, which making those claims in itself is then now in the realm of philosophy, which I would just package all together as myself, and as a theologian, I would just package that all together as theological talk. Any truth claims, we're getting into theology. So a BS spot goes on. He says this after Jake gives that just simple opening around the 419 mark. BS blog says, but that's not really how it works. In the statement, if the moon exists, then it was made by magical leprechauns. So he's using this as a counterexample, is what it's called. So he goes on, even though we can prove that P is true and valid, the conclusion is absolutely ludicrous in his example. An argument is only potentially worthwhile if the premises are both true and valid, and the conclusion logically proceeds from the premises in any kind of demonstrable manner, which means every religious argument out there fails immediately, because therefore God does not proceed logically from any of the premises that they present. It is yet another example of the divine fallacy, which is, or has, I'm not sure what verb tense he uses, been coming up a lot lately, because it is the core of religious apologetics. If X, then God is not rationally defensible, yet it's all they got, isn't it? Again, that's pretty much word for word. I could have been some spots missed there. So, but before I move into the scientific theory, scientific method, I just want to explain that for BS blog. I just want to, when I talk about the scientific method, I'm going to explain what it can do and it cannot do. And what he said in this comment here is already going beyond. He's making philosophical claims and theological claims. But with that said, I just want to highlight that first, if science observes, and this is just a fact of the matter, scientists do claim apparent order, apparent design. Again, they don't say that it is, but it has an appearance. Now, some scientists in science, and when I say scientists, I mean, I think to some degree all humans are scientists. We use the scientific method every day. I mean, if you walk up to a door and it's maybe a one you hadn't seen before, just a strange looking door, you automatically are processing. You're observing, you're making a hypothesis, you're going to test the implications, and you're going to find out whether your hypothesis was true based on the implications. And if it was wrong, then obviously if it wasn't a door, then you couldn't open it, or maybe you pulled on it and the whole thing collapsed on you and it turned out it was a trap door or something else, you know. So we use scientific reasoning every day. So when I'm talking about the sciences, I'm just talking about specific fields of science, people who would call, quote unquote, advanced or professional in their field. They actually appeal to, and they witness to the order by the textbook language. They always have to use language of speaking of the beauty and design within creatures, within the DNA and the ecosystem and things like this. It always appeals to language of explaining phenomena by terms that are of order. So even if someone is going to claim that the nature does not indicate order, it is just what I would just call in Romans 1 calls suppressing the truth. They're admitting it in their language, yet in terms of actually having to say it definitively that it is orderly. No, because again, they're kind of hiding under the scientific method, saying, well, the scientific method only admits probability. We don't know for sure. It's apparent order, but it may just be chance accident. We don't know, right? So that's the first thing I want to say. No one just lives by the scientific method. We always make conclusions from it. We always check to see if the door can open. And we have to make claims. And apparently this blog spot makes the claim that atheism, that God does not exist, is a real position, which again is a philosophical claim. Observation of data doesn't take you there. Now they might be agnostic. They might really try to live concretely in that scientific method and say that they don't know whether God exists or not, but by definition, since he hasn't come down on their conscience and awakened them to his reality, they just say he does not exist. I don't know. Again, I don't know you guys. I don't know where you're coming from, what your background is, but I do pray and I do hope that maybe through this engagement you'll come to Christ and or contact our channel and we can talk about the gospel. But the second point was by way of the scientific method, when observing organized structures of the past, say like a pot or a door, an old door somewhere, maybe as under some layers of strata, some caveman type situation. Anytime you observe structures of the past, and we're using the scientific method, we always conclude and draw inferentially from that data that the structures were arranged by a mind and for a purpose, i.e. order and design. We observe the order, we observe apparent order, and thus we conclude this is probably designed by some ancient civilization. But in fact, maybe that pot was actually formed, clay had formed somehow into what it looks like a pot, like other pots of that age, but it actually wasn't. It was just the way the ground had settled, and maybe someone stepped on it and forged it, whatever. We don't know. And so scientific method, we're always taking again, drawing implications and then reworking those until we come to what we think would be a good understanding of the phenomena. And so again, if we see that intention in something, we usually just, according to the scientific method, we would just say it's probably intended. So we find a piece of pottery, and we're going to say it was made by this ancient civilization. And we're not going to question that. So it is that with such, and beyond just a pot that's just molded for drinking water or making food, soup in, throwing soup in or whatever, the natural phenomena that we see in this world, even us engaging through this medium and using language, phonics, and being able to articulate our thoughts, itself is a form of intelligence, of course. We're having an intelligent conversation via all this online stuff here. And in light of all this intelligence we observe, and even in our own lives as we live, and we live with this intention to engage one another, the scientific method, by observing all this, which we're currently living in, again, although it's inductive, so we have to say it's probably true, is that this high demonstrable observing of the universe with its clearly intricacies and order, apparent order, it would naturally lead to the conclusion of probably designed, probably created, probably more than likely the 50% and upwards it was designed. It's not going to go back the other way, just based on the data. You know, you observe all the living creatures in the universe and their diversity, Darwinian evolution, even Darwin, I think it's chapter 10 of On the Origin of Species, he questioned his own theory when it came to speciation, the growth of a simple cell and to a complex, and then morphing and forming. Environment obviously is a major factor in the development of creaturely life, but the array of it, he said there just have to be an enormous amount of data in the strata, essentially. You can quote it, it's in chapter 10 of Origin of the Species, I believe it's chapter 10. And And as we observe the data, it's just not there. It's just not there. Far and away, actually, that's not there. And so what we're left with is saying that in terms of just with the biological life, I'm just arguing right now, is it's clearly a design. There's no indication in the layers of the strata and the anything that we can observe throughout the centuries that would lead to the idea of creatures just forming through random mutation, chance variation of genetics through environment. I mean, not unless it was guided by God. So there are those that hold to a God-guided form of speciation. I personally don't, and no one on X-Garage does. So last part here. Jake the Snake here around 519 to 703. He says, if it rains, then it's wet. It rains, therefore it's wet. Now this is another just example Jake's going to give to show he's using a substitute example to then get to his example I said at the very beginning of this. If the world is unintended, then its cause was unintended, then its effects are unintended. He's using this as another example just to get to that argument. So, but I'm bringing this up because of the way in which the video responds to it. And so Jake says, if it rains, then it's wet. It rains, therefore it is wet. Jake did not specifically state in his example or his argument what the circumstances were around this statement, this example. So his example holds true. If it rains, it's wet. Don't add any particularities, no adjectives, no adverbs, nothing to that, no prepositional clauses. It's just, it's a good example. That's what it is. And so the rebuttal in the video, actually, if you go to the video around 519 to 703, so right in watch through there, you can see they bring up a counterexample, but they add particular circumstances to it to make Jake's look like it's faulty. Although the video actually admits that they're indirectly admit that they're playing a bit with Jake's argument, because he says, but Jake's example is not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily, keyword there, philosophically, necessary. It's meaning that there is a cause for, there is a way in which we can interpret Jake's argument and make it wrong. And that would be by changing the context. So basically by taking it out of context is what BS does. BS argues it could be raining outside, but in the house, well, it's nice and dry. If it rains in Texas, that doesn't mean that it is wet here. Well, let me just play his game back on him. It doesn't mean that it's wet here. What do you mean, in Texas? If it's raining in Texas, it doesn't mean that it's wet here in Texas? Well, of course, that would not be his intended point. That's not what he said. His demonstrative, actually, here is not indicating Texas. It's assuming in his own framework here that he does not live in Texas. He lives somewhere else, okay? So we give him the benefit of the doubt there. And actually his language indicates, why would we assume illogical patterns unless we're trying to put up a straw man? And he continues, and he can say, well, you know what I meant. And but that is irrelevant. It doesn't matter what you mean. It matters what you say. And again, what Jake said was fine. This individual gave a particular context to something that was a general gnomic example, if you will. And he continues, we evaluate the words coming out of your mouth, not your intent. You need to be a little more careful about what you state, and that takes me back to the point that I was making before. And I'll just interject here before we get to that. If we're using good hermeneutics, using proper logic, then we cannot particularize the initial argument and make it say more than what the argument stated, right? That's just common sense, it's clear, and I think BS would acknowledge that they were playing around there and actually deceptively, if you think about it, in a manner for their own audience. It's not being fair to their own audience because they might not have picked up on that move and drawn them away from Jake's point, having a legitimate conversation. So in other words, Jake's initial argument that if it rains, then it is wet, which again corresponds to his argument for God's existence, and also for the, Jake's argument was actually more technical than just the existence of God. So you might want to check out Jake's video. But that initial one, if it rains, then it's wet, actually holds true in that example. And it's to assume Jake's implying something else is to misinterpret it in a contradictory fashion, as if Jake was saying, like BS did, like as if Jake's argument actually said it's raining outside. If it's raining outside, then it's raining inside the house with a completely watertight roof. Like, that's just not the point. Last section here, quote, "Even if your argument is completely logically consistent, that still doesn't mean that it is applicable to reality." Again, that's the distinction between the validity, internal validity of an argument, and its soundness. Does it correspond to reality is the question. That's the question for every argument. It doesn't matter whether you're claiming theism, atheism, agnosticism. They all fall into this category. Does it correspond to the real world? Well, let's debate about it. You can have a perfectly valid syllogism about the Jedi, the Force, and Star Wars, but the conclusion, even though it is absolutely warranted based on the premises, still has zero application to the real world that we live in. And of course, that one would, because it's regarding the Jedi, the Force, and Star Wars. And that's why we have, this is quoting again, and that's why we have made the point many times that you cannot prove reality with philosophy. It's simply the wrong tool for the job. If we are going to evaluate the real world, we need to use a tool that actually examines the real world objectively, and that's not philosophy, it's science. So we're going to get into this here to conclude on what is science. But the religious have nothing that can actually be evaluated by science, so they have to run around with a goalpost and play make-believe with philosophy, and I'm sorry, it doesn't matter how you feel, it doesn't work like that, or work that way, end quote. So, so the scientific method, what is it? How does it work? Again, I've already alluded to it throughout this video and indicated it. Just to kind of recap, but the scientific method is based on what is called hypothetical reasoning. So this is very important for our viewers and also for BS blog and his viewers, or his, I don't know if it's a group or what, for your viewers. Hypothetical reasoning is needed when one searches for explanations beyond what is demonstrably observed in one's present, or is what is already what one would call a certainty or a truth. Again, certainty and truth, if only using scientific method, does not exist. So certainty and truth is off the table there. It's just, and even observation itself actually falls out of, again, certainty and truth according to this paradigm, because even your ability to reason and think and know the world around you is subject to failure. So you can never truly know anything. But the latter, so certainty and truth, absolute truth claims actually, again, do not exist on a scientific method. The scientific method is by definition based on probability. That's that idea of that hypothetical nature of scientific reasoning, and it can only construct models, these templates on how to observe or understand natural phenomena, and so yeah, but nothing is ever certain or definitive. Ever. And this goes back to what is called the uniformity of nature. And this is the great assumption which many individuals, which I want to bring to BS Spot's attention, that this is one of those areas that's often just somehow overlooked, and it's intrinsic to the scientific method's ability to even function, really. So the uniformity of nature, the scientific method rests upon the presupposition that nature will behave a certain way from present to tomorrow onward. If it doesn't, then everything falls out, right? So it's actually predicated upon a very thing that it cannot prove. The method itself cannot prove something. It actually has to take for granted, and that is the uniformity of nature. And so the method itself is rooted upon faith, or a basic assumption, and then proceeds from there and constructs potential answers which are never again certain, because it's all based on hypotheticals. It's based on an unknown, generally unknown world in which we live in. We're just observing the present and going off of the idea that it just happens to be consistent. We don't know why, etc. That'd be the kind of language of the scientific method. And so again, to make atheistic claims, even agnostic claims or theist claims, they all fall into the same category of, I would call, theological claims. It's actually making a claim about God. Either he is or he is not. The agnostic is suspending the question. The atheist is suppressing the witness of God in creation, and that which we all do. We all do. Even believing Christians struggle and wrestle with the Lord's word over their own lives, and so we wrestle with Him, and we want our own way. We want our own lives our way, and we come to find that God's way is always the way in which is best for us, even as individual subjects. Like living out God's will according to how He's designed us is wonderful. So yeah, that is all. Again, you're not beyond philosophical claims, BS. You are completely falling into the territory of philosophy, and even the method itself stands upon faith assumptions, again, the uniformity of nature. So with that said, if we're going to be using the scientific method, then the conclusion will always be in the realm of probability. Just that's how the method works. For an example, from the atheist position, when regarding this whole conversation, if we read the data of the universe, just observing the way things are, including all biological life, and we observe it, and we at the end of the day we look at it and we just say it just happens to exist. The causation, it just happens to be. It's not. There's no conclusion is that there's no God guiding. There's no reason for God to be guiding this, nor is there any reason that He exists, etc. If that is the position, then probably the probability, the conclusion would be it's probably true that God does not exist, according to that mind frame. So I get where BS is coming from. He's observing natural phenomena. He's just saying, hey, I don't need to appeal to intentionality or unintentionality. It's just, I don't know what you're reading the data as. It just happens to be. Therefore, God does not exist, probably does not exist. That would be your position if you're just on the scientific method. So note the conclusion there is an interpretation. Whether or not God exists or the probability of Him is an interpretation from the data. So it's a philosophical claim, theological claim. Another example, let's give a second one from let's go agnostic position. If I read the data of the universe and all biological life, just the same data. I'm looking at the same data the other individual just was, only this time it indicates maybe not, maybe it is happenstance, maybe nothing did cause the universe. I don't know. That's how I'm reading it. Then probably my conclusion is God may or may not exist. I don't know. See how that conclusion follows from my reading of the data. I'm not seeing order. I'm not necessarily, or excuse me, I do see apparent order, but I'm just not willing to say whether or not that's God or not. Well, then that's, again, an interpretation of the data, and it's making conclusions from that probably, maybe not God is. That's the agnostic position. So again, that's interpretation, philosophical, theological claims. Or on the other hand, if I read the data of the universe and all biological life is indicating an inner structure, structural structure itself is order. So if I'm seeing structure, as my hands show structure, and my eyes do, as they can see, which is marvelous, and I observe these things in the data. This is data. Then I'm naturally going to conclude that this is an indication of God. So this the probability falls that God's existence is the necessary implication or inference from the data. I wouldn't say with such structure and such design, observing this apparent design, that apparently God doesn't exist, or apparently he may or may not. I would say he apparently does. So again, if we follow the method consistently, I think again, it's not who's using science and who's not. It's whose interpretation of the data is sound, or in this case, cogent. And the fact is, there's so many levels to argumentation on God's existence, from order, beauty, morality, truth values, that I think it's overwhelming, the evidence that we deal with every day. And so Jake's modus tollens, modus ponens, is valid and sound. Yeah, I don't know if I can say much more there. He mentions a bit more. He says, because I do not see intention anywhere, and the universe continues to exist just fine without it. Because this is where the religious tend to go completely off the rails. And so again, I can say you just went completely off the rails. It is demonstrable. Again, my hand in my eyes as an example, is a demonstration to you of structure. And therefore, what that term right there is indication of apparent order, of apparent structure. And therefore, apparently God does exist. So again, it's not about who's on and off the rails here, but rather who's interpreting reality properly. And according to the psalmist, the heavens declare the glory of God, that life itself is the indicative of God. But we, as according to Scripture, as fallen, reject God's rule, and we set up our own rule in his place. That's the whole narrative of the fall. So we go our own way. We rule east of Eden, and that is transgression, and that God has actually, through this, demonstrated his nature and character in paying the judgment that we deserve by offending a holy, perfect, good, loving God. Love is just, by the way. We miss that in our society nowadays. That Jesus would absorb our wrath due to us, that we would no longer be under the wrath if we take faith in his work and not our own on the day of judgment. So much I could say, so much more, and I hope this was helpful for BS blog and for our viewers. And we pray that the Lord would use this to reveal the truth of the gospel, and lead others to get to know God through Scripture. That God has revealed himself. He has not left us without witness in creation and in his word. And he does care deeply for us, and he's given us this time, this day and age, this last age, if you will, this time for repentance, to come to Christ before his return in the judgment, and then the establishing a new creation without sin, death, and a brokenness.